The waters of the Mediterranean lapped softly against the curved shore of Alexandria, a city born from the dreams of conquerors and sculpted by the winds of time. In the quiet moments of dawn, when the sky was brushed with pale rose and silver, the city seemed to breathe in harmony with the sea. Its marble colonnades glimmered faintly, as if still holding the glow of stars that had watched over them through the night. It was here, in this city of light and learning, that a child named Cleopatra first opened her eyes to the world. Her cradle was surrounded not only by silks and golden ornaments, but by the hum of scholars reciting verses, of priests whispering prayers, and of traders from distant lands speaking in voices heavy with strange accents. From her earliest breaths, she was wrapped not only in fabrics but in the languages of the earth. The palace she grew in was a world unto itself. Vast gardens where lotus flowers floated lazily on cool ponds, and halls where mosaics shimmered beneath oil lamps, casting soft patterns onto the polished floors. Even as a child, Cleopatra would wander quietly along the shaded courtyards, her small feet padding over marble warmed by the sun. Servants and tutors would follow, but often they allowed her to pause and listen. For Cleopatra listened to everything: the rustling of palms, the murmuring of distant philosophers, the creak of ships in the harbor. It was as though she knew that every sound carried meaning, and that each whisper of the world would one day return to her in the language of power. Her father, Ptolemy, was a ruler troubled by tides of politics he could not always command. Yet to young Cleopatra, he was simply a figure whose voice was filled with the cadence of ancient hymns, and who carried the weight of tradition upon his shoulders. When he spoke, she would sit in silence, her gaze intent, absorbing not only his words but the rhythm of authority that flowed through them. The nights in Alexandria were tender and vast. The lighthouse of Pharos shone far out to sea, its flame guiding sailors home, and from the palace balconies Cleopatra would look out across the waters. The sky stretched endlessly, with constellations tracing patterns that had guided generations of her ancestors. She would lie awake, hearing the soft waves and imagining that the stars themselves whispered secrets, telling her that her life, too, would be woven into the great fabric of eternity. As she grew older, Cleopatra's lessons became more demanding. Unlike many of her lineage, she did not confine herself to Greek alone. She practiced the languages of her people, the ancient Egyptian tongue that sang like the Nile itself, flowing and eternal. She studied the words of Hebrew, Aramaic, and the soft cadences of distant lands. Each language was like a key she held in her hand, and one by one she collected them, until her mind was a treasury of voices. Scholars marveled at her, not because she learned quickly, but because she listened deeply, as though she was not merely repeating phrases, but weaving herself into the soul of each culture. In the coolness of the library's shadow, she would linger. The Library of Alexandria was no ordinary collection of scrolls. It was a sea of memory, holding the thoughts of poets, philosophers, mathematicians, and dreamers from centuries past. Cleopatra would walk among its shelves with quiet reverence. She would trace the titles with her fingers, her eyes following the careful scripts. Sometimes, in the hush of the afternoon, she would sit beside an elder scribe who read softly, his voice steady as the slow turning of the Nile. These hours sank into her heart, forming not only knowledge with serenity, a deep understanding that wisdom is patient, never hurried. Seasons changed in the land of Egypt with the rhythm of the Nile. The river swelled and receded, leaving behind fertile soil, the eternal gift of the flood. Cleopatra watched from balconies as the fields stretched green, dotted with workers who sang as they labored. To her, their voices rose like prayer, their melodies twining with the heartbeat of the earth. She understood, even in youth, that her people lived by this river, breathed by it, dreamed by it, and in her quiet moments, she promised herself she would never forget the bond between the crown and the current, between ruler and river. As evening fell, the palace grew hushed. Lamps were lit, their flames trembling softly in bronze holders. The air carried the faint scent of lotus and myrrh. Cleopatra would sit near her tutors, her mind still restless with questions. They would tell her stories of the ancient pharaohs, of queens who bore crowns like the sun, of gods who guided mortals with unseen hands. These tales were not merely lessons. They were lullabies of heritage, wrapping her in the knowledge that she belonged to something vast and unbroken, a chain of rulers whose voices echoed across centuries. And when sleep finally came to her, it was like the slow unfurling of a papyrus scroll. Her dreams drifted between the gentle rhythm of oars gliding across the Nile and the soft glimmer of jewels beneath torchlight. The future waited silently, like a horizon veiled in mist. For now, Cleopatra was only a child, swaying between worlds, between the laughter of youth and the destiny of queenship, between the songs of her people and the silence of stars that watched over her slumber. The years passed as gently as the Nile flows, carrying Cleopatra from the lightness of childhood into the quiet gravity of youth. The palace halls, once vast playgrounds, began to feel like chambers of expectation. Servants bowed more deeply now, and tutors lingered longer over her lessons. She was no longer simply a daughter of the house of Ptolemy. She was a reflection of Egypt's future, a jewel being polished by time. Her father's reign was not always steady. The winds of politics blew in unpredictable patterns, carrying with them tensions from Rome, whispers of unrest at home, and the endless balancing act of a kingdom stretched between ancient tradition and the tides of foreign influence. Cleopatra, though still young, was never shielded from these undercurrents. At dinners where statesmen spoke in hushed voices, she listened carefully, storing away every pause, every careful word. She had learned long before that silence itself could be a form of power. In the quiet gardens of the palace, she often walked alone. The lotus ponds mirrored the sky, and reeds swayed gently in the breeze. Here, she practiced the art of thought, how to breathe slowly, how to weigh words before speaking, how to notice the smallest detail, like the way a bird tilts its head before flight. She understood that the rule was not simply command, but to watch, to listen, to learn from the world's quieter lessons. Her studies deepened. She read not only poetry but philosophy, not only hymns but treatises, the scrolls filled with the wisdom of those who had shaped nations. At night, when others slept, she would sometimes sit beneath the flickering glow of a single oil lamp, her face serene as her eyes moved across lines of script. The gentle scratching of reed pens in the library became a lullaby she knew by heart. It was in these years that her presence began to carry its own aura. Visitors to the palace often remarked that the young princess seemed older than her age, her gaze steady, her speech flowing with clarity beyond her years. Yet there was nothing severe in her manner. Cleopatra carried warmth as well as wisdom, a softness in her smile, a voice that could ease tension as easily as it could command attention. She was, even then, a harmony of contrasts, poised yet gentle, curious yet cautious, youthful yet touched by something timeless. Beyond the palace walls, Egypt continued its eternal rhythm. Farmers sowed and harvested in rhythm with the Nile. Priests tended the temples fragrant with incense. Merchants bartered with spices and silks. Cleopatra loved these glimpses of life beyond marble and gold. Sometimes veiled in quiet, she would ride with attendants into the city, listening to the hum of the marketplace, watching the way the people moved, the way they laughed, the way they bent beneath baskets of fruit and jars of water. These moments stayed with her, for she understood that a ruler's crown was only as steady as the trust of those who toil beneath the sun. Her bond with language continued to blossom. When she spoke Egyptian, her words flowed like the river itself, carrying echoes of temples and hymns. In Greek, her speech was crisp, balanced like a verse of poetry. In the tongues of other lands, she found new shades of meaning, new ways of weaving herself into the hearts of those who came from afar. This gift became her quiet lantern, one that would later light her path in the darkest corridors of diplomacy. As the horizon of her youth widened, the threads of destiny began to weave more tightly around her. Whispers of succession floated through the palace, carried in conversations she was not meant to hear. Some spoke of alliances, others of rivals, and still others of Rome, whose presence loomed like a vast shadow stretching across the Mediterranean. Cleopatra, still in her teens, felt the weight of these murmurs, though she bore them with the calm patience of one who had long prepared for storms. In the evenings, when the sun dipped into the horizon and painted the Nile with molten gold, Cleopatra would retreat to the balconies. The breeze was soft there, carrying the scent of water and distant blossoms. She would lean against a cool stone and watch the river move. To her, it was a mirror of life, always flowing, always shifting, yet eternal in its course. She whispered her thoughts to the river, as if it were an old companion, confiding her hopes and her uncertainties. And though the water carried her words away, she felt it answered in silence, steady and eternal. Slowly, the child who had listened with wide eyes in marble halls was becoming a young woman who carried her own quiet power. Her voice, once filled with questions, now spoke with the cadence of understanding. Her heart, once untethered, now moved with purpose. She was being shaped, gently and unhurriedly, by the flow of time, like a stone polished smooth by the current, and though she did not yet know it, the path ahead would carry her into the presence of the greatest powers of her age. But for now, in the calm light of the Alexandrian dusk, she remained in a tender season of waiting, her life poised like a harp string touched lightly by the breeze, resonant, ready, but still singing softly to itself. The palace of Alexandria was never truly silent. Even in the stillness of night, there were always the faintest echoes, the footsteps of guards along the colonnades, the whisper of wind through open courtyards, the distant sound of waves brushing the shore. Cleopatra, now stepping gracefully into her later youth, had grown attuned to these murmurs. To her, they were like the steady breathing of Egypt itself, a reminder that the kingdom was alive, always awake, always shifting. It was during these years that the tides of succession began to stir with greater urgency. Her father's rule faltered at times, buffeted by pressures from Rome and entanglements within the royal family. In those marble chambers, where gilded thrones gleamed under torchlight, the air often felt heavy with unspoken questions. Who would inherit? Who would guide Egypt into the uncertain dawn? Cleopatra listened to these questions as if they were notes in a distant melody, a song she would soon be asked to sing herself. In the mornings, she still walked among the palace gardens, where papyrus reeds bent gently toward the ponds and lotus blossoms opened their white petals to the sun. But her thoughts had grown more complex. As she strolled past statues of ancient kings and queens, she often wondered about their burdens. Did they, too, feel the weight of expectation pressing upon their shoulders? Did they whisper their doubts into the silence of dawn, as she sometimes did? Or had their crowns rested more easily, untouched by the storms of empire? Her lessons with advisors became less about poetry and more about governance. She listened to accounts of harvest yields, of trade agreements, of temple rituals and military strength. Though the figures were intricate and the details demanding, Cleopatra approached them with patience, her eyes following every number and name as though each were part of a tapestry she was destined to weave. Her tutors often paused, impressed by her ability not only to absorb but to respond, to ask the quiet question that revealed her deeper understanding. But Cleopatra was not shaped only by scrolls and lessons. She was shaped by listening. To the voices of farmers who spoke of the floods, to priests who carried the weight of rituals older than memory, to travelers whose eyes held a reflection of distant horizons. Whenever she could, she sought these voices, weaving them into the fabric of her thoughts. To her, ruling was not to stand above, but to walk alongside, to carry the rhythms of her people's lives as gently as one carries a vessel of water. Her relationship with her siblings was more delicate. The Ptolemaic dynasty was a house of both grandeur and rivalry, where affection was often entwined with ambition. Cleopatra, with her quiet watchfulness, learned to move carefully, offering warmth without surrendering ground, showing grace while guarding her own heart. She understood that crowns were not simply inherited. They were contested, balanced like the scales of Maat, swaying with every shift of loyalty. When her father traveled, leaving Egypt for a time, Cleopatra found herself stepping more firmly into the light of responsibility. She did not claim authority outright, but she began to guide gently. A suggestion here, a decision there, her presence steady and composed. Those around her noticed. Advisors spoke of her calmness. Servants whispered her kindness, and priests nodded approvingly when she joined them in prayer, her voice steady as incense curled into the air. Beyond the palace, the city of Alexandria thrived in its usual brilliance. Ships arrived daily, sails filled with the wind of distant lands, their hulls heavy with grain, papyrus, spices, and silks. The streets were alive with color, the air rich with the mingling of countless tongues. From high terraces, Cleopatra would watch the ceaseless movement, the endless exchange of life and culture. She understood, even without being told, that Egypt was more than its throne. It was a meeting place of worlds, a place where rivers of humanity converged. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and the sky deepened into shades of violet and gold, Cleopatra stood at the balcony overlooking the harbor. The great lighthouse of Pharos sent its steady flame out across the waters, guiding vessels safely to shore. She leaned on the cool stone rail, the breeze carrying the scent of salt and myrrh. In that moment, she felt both the vastness of her kingdom and the intimacy of her own thoughts. She whispered softly to the night, promising to hold Egypt as the river held its banks, firm yet yielding, eternal yet ever-changing. It was not long after that the first true trials came. Rumors of unrest reached the palace, murmurs of shifting alliances, whispers of Rome's growing influence. Cleopatra, still so young, felt the world around her tilt ever so slightly, as though the stage on which she was destined to walk had begun to move beneath her feet. Yet she did not falter. Instead, she gathered herself in silence, the way the lotus closes gently at dusk, conserving its strength for the return of the dawn. For even as storms gathered in the distance, Cleopatra carried within her a calm that no turmoil could steal. Her childhood of listening, her youth of learning, her heart shaped by language and river and star, all of it prepared her for the moment when the crown, heavy and gleaming, would rest upon her brow. And though she did not yet reach for it, the crown was already beginning to reach for her. The throne of Egypt was never merely a chair of gold. It was a symbol older than memory, a bridge between mortal and divine, a vessel carrying the weight of centuries. When Cleopatra's time came to step into its light, the world seemed to hold its breath. The marble halls, the shaded gardens, the ever-flowing Nile, all watched silently as the young queen moved closer to her destiny. Her coronation was not marked by thunder or trumpet, but by the deep, resonant stillness of ritual. Priests carried sacred symbols, their voices rising in hymns as incense curled like gentle clouds, sweet and steady. The scent lingered in the air, soft as a dream, while golden rays of sun fell through the high columns, wrapping Cleopatra in a quiet glow. She stood with calm grace, her eyes lowered, her heart steady. When the crown of Egypt, the double crown of upper and lower lands, was placed upon her head, she did not tremble. She simply breathed, her breath as even as the Nile's eternal current. In that moment, she was no longer merely Cleopatra, daughter of Ptolemy. She became the living embodiment of Isis, the mother and protector, the queen whose presence bound heaven and earth. Those who looked upon her did not see only youth. They saw the continuation of something sacred, something unbroken, flowing like the river that fed the land. Her reign began quietly. She did not rush to alter the order of things. Instead, she observed. She listened to her advisors, to her priests, to her people. She read reports of harvests, studied the account of trade, and sat in council with generals who spoke of borders and threats. Each word was weighed, each choice measured, as though she were balancing a delicate scale that must never tip too far. Her decisions were not loud, but they were firm, and soon those around her began to recognize a strength that lay not in force, but in clarity. Cleopatra understood that Egypt's soul was bound to the Nile. She devoted herself to its rhythms, ensuring that canals were tended, that granaries were filled, that temples received their due. When the floods came, she offered prayers with her people, her presence uniting ruler and subject in the shared hope for abundance. When the floods receded, she walked among the fields, her sandals brushing against the rich soil, speaking gently with farmers whose hands bore the strength of the land. To them, she was not distant marble, but a living presence, a queen who saw, who heard, who understood. In Alexandria, the great city continued to glow with its own brilliance. The lighthouse still guided sailors, the library still guarded its oceans of memory, and the streets pulsed with the mingling of nations. Cleopatra's presence in the city was quiet yet magnetic. When she moved through the colonnades, her steps slow and serene, those who saw her often lowered their voices, as if the air itself softened around her. She did not need to command attention. It followed her naturally, drawn to her as rivers are drawn to the sea. Yet ruling was never without storms. Within her own family, rivalries stirred, brothers and sisters, bound by blood yet divided by ambition. circled the throne with restless hearts. Cleopatra felt the weight of their presence, the unspoken challenges, the silent tests. Still, she met them with calm patience, never allowing bitterness to stain her composure. She had learned long ago that silence could be sharper than words, and that time itself was often the greatest ally. From beyond Egypt's borders came the steady gaze of Rome. That vast republic stretched its influence across the Mediterranean, its ships casting shadows over waters once ruled only by pharaohs. Cleopatra was keenly aware of this looming power. She studied Rome not with fear but with care, noting its patterns, its leaders, its ambitions. She understood that Egypt could not stand apart, but must instead learn to move gracefully beside such a force, neither yielding nor defying, but balancing, as the lotus balances itself upon the water's surface. And so, in those first years of her reign, Cleopatra lived as though she were weaving a tapestry. Each thread was chosen with thought. The grain harvest tended with diligence, the temples honored with reverence, the people seen with kindness, the diplomats met with careful words. The fabric she wove was strong, though delicate, shimmering quietly with promise. In the evenings, when the work of the day was done, Cleopatra often returned to her balcony. The sea stretched out before her, the lighthouse flamed steady, the horizon fading into indigo calm. She would stand there, the cool stone beneath her hands, the wind carrying the faint taste of salt and jasmine. The world was vast, the challenges many, but she felt herself anchored, her spirit steady as the stars above. She whispered again, as she had in youth, to the eternal river, a promise that she would hold Egypt as gently and as firmly as the Nile held its banks. And in that gentle vow, her reign began to find its rhythm, a rhythm as calm as the unfolding night, as patient as the stars, as unyielding as the river's course. The sea beyond Alexandria was never still. Ships came and went like thoughts across the mind of the world, some carrying grain from Egypt's fertile fields, others bearing goods from distant coasts, still others sailing under the stern banners of Rome. For Cleopatra, the horizon had always carried whispers of that faraway power, and now, in the tender unfolding of her reign, those whispers grew nearer. Rome was vast, a republic of iron discipline and endless ambition. Its senators debated in marble halls. Its generals commanded legions that moved like rivers of steel, and its influence stretched across the Mediterranean like the shadow of a great eagle. Cleopatra, from her marble city by the sea, knew well that to guide Egypt's path, she must understand the shape of Rome's wings. At first, Rome came not in the form of armies, but in the language of politics. Envoys arrived, their robes heavy with dignity, their words careful and deliberate. Cleopatra received them with the serene composure she had long cultivated. Her throne room glowed with torchlight, the scent of lotus drifting in the air, while the murmur of the Nile outside was steady, as though the river itself bore witness to each exchange. She listened as they spoke of treaties, of trade, of alliances, her expression calm, her replies smooth as silk. To them, she was no ordinary ruler. She was a presence both gentle and commanding, a queen who spoke not only with her lips, but with the quiet music of her very being. Yet politics was never free of storm. Rome's gaze fell heavily upon Egypt, seeing not only its treasures, but its position, its harbors, its fields of golden grain that fed nations. Cleopatra understood that her kingdom was both jewel and prize, and that to preserve its freedom, she must weave carefully between diplomacy and strength. She did not resist Rome openly, nor did she bow too quickly. Instead, she held her ground with grace, like a lotus standing steady against the current. It was during these early years that Cleopatra's destiny began to brush against the lives of Rome's most powerful men. The first name that reached her ears with weight was Julius Caesar, a general whose brilliance carried him from the battlefields of Gaul to the very heart of Rome itself. His reputation traveled faster than ships, a man of vision and ambition, admired and feared in equal measure. Cleopatra, though she had not yet seen him, felt the edges of his presence, as though the winds themselves carried his name. Her first true meeting with Rome's leaders came not in triumph, but in tension. Within her own family, rivalries had deepened, and her brother's supporters sought Roman favor. Cleopatra, young but resolute, knew that she could not allow her claim to Egypt's throne to be decided without her voice. So, with the patience of one who was long prepared, she resolved to face Rome directly. The night she set her course toward this destiny, Alexandria lay hushed beneath a sky heavy with stars. Cleopatra walked slowly through the quiet corridors of her palace, her steps soft against the marble floors. She paused at the balcony, as she often did, looking out toward the lighthouse whose flame guided all who sailed the waters. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, as though drawing the strength of the river and the sea into herself. When she opened them again, her gaze was calm, her decision firm. She would meet Rome not as a supplicant, but as a queen, and so began the weaving of a bond that would echo through history. A bond not only of politics, but of presence, not only of treaties, but of trust. When Cleopatra finally came face to face with Caesar, it was as though two rivers had converged. He, with his sharp eyes and mind that stretched far beyond borders, and she, with her serene gaze and wisdom drawn from the flow of ages. Their first meeting was not thunderous nor swift. It was a quiet recognition, an unspoken understanding that their fates had entwined. For Cleopatra, this was not the loss of Egypt's soul, but its preservation. She understood that Rome could not be cast aside, but she also knew that Egypt's voice could not be silenced. By standing beside Caesar, she gave her kingdom not only protection but presence, weaving Egypt's name into the very heart of Rome's story. And though history would one day remember their union in many ways, in this moment it was simply the meeting of two wills, two visions drawn together across the sea of time. In the evenings that followed, Cleopatra still returned to her balcony, still leaned against the cool stone, still whispered her thoughts to the river. But now her words carried a new weight, for she spoke not only of Egypt but of Rome, not only of survival but of harmony. She felt the vastness of the world more keenly than ever, and yet she carried it with calm grace, as one carries a lamp through the quiet corridors of night. And so the gentle current of her reign began to mingle with the tides of Rome, setting in motion a story that would travel across centuries, a story of power, of love, of tragedy, yet also of serenity, of wisdom, of a queen who held within her the patience of the Nile and the light of the stars. The meeting of Cleopatra and Caesar did not come with thunder nor with the clash of armies, but with a slow unfolding of presence, the quiet recognition of two currents meeting, each carrying its own weight, its own destiny. Caesar, seasoned by battles and tempered by ambition, found in Cleopatra something he had not expected. A ruler whose wisdom was born not of conquest, but of listening, of patience, of harmony with the land she guided. To Cleopatra, Caesar was no mere visitor. He was the embodiment of Rome's vast reach, the living force behind the tides that pressed against Egypt's shores. Yet when she looked upon him, she did not see only the general or the statesman. She saw a man whose eyes held a restless fire, a mind always turning, a spirit searching for something greater than the laurels of war. She met that restlessness with calm, her voice carrying the music of waters, her words flowing with the rhythm of thought. Their bond grew in the quiet moments. In the palace halls, where torchlight trembled on polished stone, they spoke in low tones, their conversations drifting far beyond politics. They spoke of the nature of rule, of the fragility of peace, of the weaving of nations into something greater than themselves. Cleopatra, with her gift for languages, slipped easily into Caesar's tongue, her words shaped with precision yet softened by her natural grace. He listened, not as a conqueror, but as a man drawn into a deeper current than he had known before. The city of Alexandria felt their union like a subtle change in the air. Ships came and went, markets hummed. The lighthouse shone its steady flame. Yet within the palace, the rhythm was altered. Cleopatra and Caesar walked side by side through shaded courtyards, their steps unhurried, their voices blending with the whisper of fountains. At times they shared silence, gazing across the gardens where lotus flowers opened to the sun. At other times, their laughter rose, soft and unexpected, like the ripple of water against a boat's hull. It was not only companionship that their bond brought. Together, they began to shape the fate of Egypt with a steadier hand. Caesar's presence secured Cleopatra's throne against rivals, while her presence gave him something Rome alone could not, the sense of a world older than his, deeper than his victories, rooted in rhythms eternal. She showed him the Nile cycle, how the river swelled and fell, how the people sang their lives in harmony with its course. To Caesar, It was a revelation, a reminder that power was not only the command of legions, but also the patient tending of life itself. Their time together carried a softness, as though the world itself slowed to let them breathe. Evenings were their sanctuary. The sky above Alexandria turned gold, then violet, then deep with stars. Lamps flickered, casting warm pools of light upon marble floors. Cleopatra would sit by an open window, her dark hair catching glow, her eyes calm as she listened to Caesar's tales of Rome, its senators, its triumphs, its endless contest for power. When he spoke of his struggles, she would answer not with counsel alone, but with quiet assurance, reminding him that even the mightiest storms pass, and even the river yields only to time. In turn, Caesar listened to her dreams for Egypt, not of empire, but of balance, of temples tended, of fields abundant, of people living with dignity beneath the sun. He marveled at her vision, so different from the grasping ambition of Rome. For her, power was not possession but stewardship, not glory but harmony. And in this vision, he glimpsed something he had long forgotten. The beauty of ruling not for conquest, but for care. The bond between them deepened further still, blessed by the quiet arrival of a child. Cleopatra named him Caesarion, the little Caesar, the living thread between two worlds. To her, he was not merely an heir, but a symbol of unity, a gentle promise that Egypt and Rome need not stand apart, but could be joined in life, in blood, in future. She cradled him with tenderness, singing softly in the ancient tongue of her people, her voice carrying the lull of the Nile itself. Caesar, watching, felt a stillness within him, as though the restless fire of his heart had, for a moment, found its shore. The palace of Alexandria, with its gardens and shining halls, seemed to glow more brightly in those days. Scholars whispered that wisdom and power had found companionship. Merchants spoke of prosperity flowing steadily once more. Priests lifted prayers, believing the gods themselves smiled upon the union. Yet Cleopatra and Caesar, though aware of the world's gaze, lived their bond in quietude, in the gentle rhythm of shared presence. Still, beyond the calm walls, the tides of history moved. Rome was a place of endless rivalries, and Caesar's name stirred both loyalty and resentment. Cleopatra knew, in the stillness of her heart, that their time was as delicate as a lotus petal floating on the river. Yet she did not dwell on uncertainty. Instead, she savored the moments, storing them like precious scrolls in the library of her soul. And so, in those tender years, Cleopatra lived a chapter unlike any other, a chapter of companionship, of shared vision, of love that flowed as softly and as inexorably as the Nile. The queen who had once whispered her thoughts to the river now found her voice heard by one of the mightiest men of her age. And together, they wrote their names not in stone alone, but in the quiet breath of evenings, in the laughter gardens, in the gaze of a child whose very life was a union of two great worlds. The seasons moved gently in Egypt, marked not by the clash of empires, but by the swelling and retreat of the Nile. Each year the waters rose, flooding the field with life, and each year they receded, leaving behind the fertile soil that fed a kingdom. In this rhythm, Cleopatra found comfort, even as she watched the currents of destiny begin to shift. Caesar's time in Alexandria was never meant to be eternal. He was bound to Rome, to the Senate, to the restless world that demanded his presence. And yet, when he prepared to depart, the air was heavy with the quiet ache of parting. The palace seemed to listen as Cleopatra and Caesar shared their last evenings together. They walked slowly beneath the colonnades, their voices hushed, as though the stones themselves held the memory of their words. For Cleopatra, his leaving was like the ebb of the Nile, natural, inevitable, yet tinged with longing. She did not cling to him, for she understood the weight of empire and the path he must follow. Instead, she offered him calm, reminding him that Egypt would remain a steadfast shore he could return to. Their child, Caesarion, was the living bond between them, a promise that no distance could erase. When Caesar's ships finally sailed from the harbor, their sails swelling with the Mediterranean wind, Cleopatra stood upon the palace balcony, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She did not weep, for her strength was not in outward display, but in quiet endurance. She watched until the vessels became no more than shadows upon the water, and even then she remained still, listening to the whisper of the sea as though it carried his voice back to her. Life in Alexandria resumed its rhythm. The markets bustled. The scholars debated in the libraries. The priests tended their temples. Cleopatra returned to her duties with the same serenity she always carried, her mind sharp, her heart steady. Yet within her, there was a gentle shift. A space once filled by Caesar's presence now became a chamber of memory, where their laughter lingered and their conversations echoed softly, like voices carried on the wind. She devoted herself to Caesar Ion, nurturing him with tenderness and care. To the people, he was a symbol of Egypt's strength, a child born of two worlds. To Cleopatra, he was her anchor, a reminder of love's enduring thread, woven to the fabric of her reign. She sang to him beneath the stars, the ancient lullabies of her ancestors, filling his dreams with the calm of the Nile and the warmth of the sun. In time, news traveled across the sea, borne by messengers and merchants. Word of Caesar's triumphs in Rome reached Alexandria, his name spoken with reverence and envy alike. Cleopatra listened, her expression serene, yet her thoughts reaching across the distance, imagining him beneath the Roman sky, surrounded by voices both loyal and treacherous. She knew the nature of power, knew that even the mightiest stood upon shifting sands. And still, she held faith in the bond they shared, in the vision they had glimpsed together of a world bound not only by conquest, but by harmony. Years unfolded gently, each one carrying Egypt forward. Cleopatra's reign grew steadier, her people flourishing beneath her guidance. She strengthened alliances, tended the rituals of the gods, and walked among her subjects with quiet dignity. Her image was carved in temples, her name inscribed in stone, yet her truest presence was in the daily rhythm of life, in the flowing water channels, in the grain that filled the markets, in the songs sung by workers as the sun dipped low. And though the world beyond Egypt stirred with unrest, within her realm there was a calm that bore her imprint. For Cleopatra ruled not with a hand of iron, but with the patience of the river, the certainty that even in times of change, life would flow onward, steady and sure. Yet the tide of fate is never still. The winds of Rome would blow once more toward Egypt, carrying both promise and sorrow. For though Cleopatra cherished her time with Caesar, history's current was already bending, preparing to draw her into another chapter, one of both grandeur and fragility, of love once again, and of trials as vast as the desert itself. But for now, in these quiet years after his departure, Cleopatra lived in a balance of memory and hope. She tended her kingdom with grace, raised her child with love, and carried within her the soft flame of connection that distance could not extinguish. The nights were long and filled with stars, and as she gazed upon them, she felt not the emptiness of absence, but the gentle assurance that across oceans and across time, their spirits still moved together beneath the same eternal sky. The years passed, soft as drifting sands, yet the memory of Caesar never faded from Cleopatra's heart. She carried him with her in silence, in the way she stood upon the palace terraces at dawn, gazing eastward as though his presence lingered in the horizon's glow. Egypt blossomed beneath her care, yet her thoughts often stretched across the Mediterranean, reaching toward Rome where Caesar's name grew ever brighter and ever more burdened. Rome was a city of triumph and tension. News came to Alexandria by ship, each sail carrying whispers of Caesar's rising glory. He was hailed as a hero, showered with honors, crowned in victories. The Senate, once his rival, now bent beneath his will. To the Roman people, he was almost a king in all but name, though Rome, in its ancient pride, could not yet bear the word. Cleopatra listened to these tidings with calm attention. She understood what others might not, that greatness was a fragile thing, and the higher one rose, the more shadows gathered at one's feet. She knew Caesar's strength, but also the restless envy of those around him. In her quiet moments, as she watched Caesar Ion sleep beside the flicker of an oil lamp, she wondered whether the child would ever walk beside his father's hand in the streets of Rome, or whether fate would keep their worlds apart. And then, one spring day, the message arrived. It came with no grandeur, no ceremony, but with a heavy stillness of grief wrapped in parchment. Julius Caesar was gone, struck down not by foreign enemies, but by the very hands of those who had once called him friend. In the heart of the Senate itself, where laws were spoken and futures decided, his life had been undone in an instant. The palace fell into silence. Servants paused in their steps. Guards lowered their eyes. The hum of daily life seemed to fade into the hush of disbelief. Cleopatra, upon hearing the words, closed her eyes and let the quiet surround her. She did not cry out, for her sorrow was too deep for outward display. Instead, she sat by the open window, the same window where once she had listened to Caesar speak of Rome, and she let the wind brush against her face, carrying with it the weight of loss. Her heart felt both heavy and hollow, as though a great pillar had been pulled from beneath the sky. Yet she did not let despair consume her. She thought of their child, of the bond they had woven, of the dreams they had whispered together of a world larger than conquest. Those dreams could not be undone by the envy of men or the stroke of blades. They lived on, as surely as the Nile flowed, as surely as stars returned to the sky each night. In the days that followed, Cleopatra moved with quiet strength. She mourned in her own way, not with public lament, but with the private tenderness of memory. She spoke gently to Caesar, though he was too young to understand, and in her voice carried the calm assurance that he was part of something vast, something enduring. She told him of his father not as a man lost, but as a presence that lingered, woven into the fabric of their lives, guiding them like the constellations that shone above Egypt's desert nights. The city of Alexandria, too, felt the tremor of the news. Merchants whispered what would follow. Scholars debated the fate of Rome. Priests lifted prayers for balance in a world unsteady once more. Yet within the palace, Cleopatra stood as the still center of the storm, her presence a reminder that even in the face of loss, Egypt would not falter. She knew that Caesar's death was not the end of the story, but the beginning of another chapter, one that would draw her once more into the tides of Rome's struggles, one that would test her wisdom, her patience, and her heart. For already, across the sea, new powers were rising and new voices clamored for control. But for that moment, Cleopatra allowed herself stillness. She walked through the palace gardens where the lotus flowers opened in the sun. She listened to the fountains, their water falling in endless rhythm. And she let herself remember Caesar not as a conqueror, not as a statesman, but as the man who had once stood beside her in these very halls. His voice blended with hers in quiet conversation, his laughter mingling with the night. The world would move forward, as it always did. But in Cleopatra's heart, Caesar remained not as a shadow, but as a light carried gently through the corridors of memory. And as she lifted her gaze to the heavens, she whispered to the stars that though the man was gone, the bond they had woven would live on, carried in her, in their sun, and in the endless flow of the Nile itself. Time in Egypt moved with its ancient rhythm, steady as the river that nourished the land. Seasons unfolded, the Nile rose and fell, and the people sang their songs of planting and harvest. Yet beyond Egypt's shores, the world of Rome had shifted like sand in a storm. Caesar was gone, and in his absence, new voices rose to claim his mantle. Alliances were forged and broken. Powers shifted from hand to hand, and in this restless tide, Cleopatra's name and the legacy of Caesar were never far from thought. Among the figures who rose from the tumult of Rome was Mark Antony, a man of vigor and warmth, renowned for his strength and his unshakable spirit. Where Caesar had been measured and sharp, Antony was bold and full of life. He carried himself with a certain ease, a confidence born not only of his skill as commander, but of a nature that embraced joy as readily as duty. When Cleopatra and Antony at last met, the world seemed, for a moment, to pause. The tales say that she came to him not in the simple manner of a visitor, but with the grace of a queen who understood the power of presence. Across the waters of the Cydnus River, her barge approached, sails of purple billowing in the breeze, oars dipped in silver, music carried on the air. Yet though the display was magnificent, her demeanor was serene, her eyes calm, her voice gentle. She came not as spectacle, but as harmony embodied. Antony, who had seen battlefields blaze and legions march, was captivated not by the splendor alone, but by Cleopatra herself. She spoke with wisdom. Her words flowed with the cadence of rivers and winds. She did not flatter, nor did she seek to impress with grandeur. Instead, she offered companionship, a meeting of minds and spirits. In her, Antony felt not only the presence of a queen, but a soul attuned to life's deeper currents. For Cleopatra, Antony was a new light in her journey. He was different from Caesar, yet no less compelling. Where Caesar's strength lay in vision and strategy, Antony's lay in his vitality, his ability to embrace the present moment with all its colors. She found in him a mirror of her own humanity, a partner who could laugh with her beneath the stars, who could share the weight of governance, yet also the ease of a quiet evening song. Their bond blossomed not with haste, but with the steady unfolding of trust. Together they dined in the palace halls, their conversations weaving through matters of state and stories of childhood, of dreams once held and futures yet unseen. They walked the gardens, where Antony marveled at the lotus pools and the soft fragrance of jasmine in the night air. He listened to her speak of Egypt's history, of the gods who guided its people, of the delicate balance she sought to preserve. And in turn he spoke of Rome, not only of its power but of its restless spirit, its hunger for more, and his own place within it. The people of Alexandria sensed the warmth between them. Markets seemed livelier, festivals more joyful, as if the city itself absorbed their companionship. To many, Antony was not a distant Roman, but a figure who moved among them with openness, whose laughter rang in the streets, whose presence carried a kind of ease that set him apart from other rulers of the West. Together, Cleopatra and Antony became more than leaders. They became companions in the truest sense. Two souls bound not only by politics or ambition, but by shared joy, by mutual respect, by the comfort of presence. They celebrated life with feasts and music, with poetry and laughter, yet also bore its responsibilities with steady hearts. In the quiet moments, when the torches burned low and the night wrapped the palace in stillness, Cleopatra would sit beside Antony, her hand resting gently in his. They spoke softly then, not of empires or wars, but of simple things, of the fragrance of the river reeds, of the shimmer of stars upon the water, of the dreams they held for their children and their people. For Cleopatra, Antony was not a replacement for Caesar, nor a shadow of the past. He was a new chapter, a new melody in the song of her life. And though the world beyond their union would stir with conflict and expectation, in those early days, their bond was a sanctuary, a space where love and leadership wove together as gently as threads in a tapestry. And so, the Queen of Egypt and the Roman general began their shared journey, not with conquest, but with companionship. Their lives, one separate rivers, now joined, flowing side by side toward a horizon both luminous and uncertain. The city of Alexandria glowed with brightness all its own, yet in the days of Cleopatra and Antony, that glow seemed even warmer, as though joy itself had settled upon its streets. The harbor bustled with ships, sails shimmering in the sun. The great lighthouse sent its flame across the sea, guiding travelers to a city alive with laughter, music, and the fragrance of spices drifting through the markets. Within its walls, Cleopatra and Antony wove a life that was both tender and grand, like a tapestry threaded with silk and sunlight. Together, they turned the palace into a sanctuary of companionship. Banquets stretched long into the night, not with excess, but with warmth. Musicians played softly on harps and flutes, their melodies rising and falling like the hush of the sea. Dancers moved with grace, their footsteps light as wind upon sand. Antony, so often hardened by campaigns and politics, found himself softened by the rhythm of Egypt, by the way time seemed to slow, by the way laughter came easily in Cleopatra's presence. Cleopatra, in turn, delighted in Antony's vitality. He lived fully, embracing not only duty but joy, and she admired how naturally he moved among her people. He walked the marketplaces without pretense, speaking with merchants, sampling fruits offered from baskets, smiling at children who followed him with curious eyes. To the Alexandrians, he became not merely a Roman general, but part of the living fabric of their city, a presence as approachable as it was powerful. The pair became known for their shared feasts, gatherings that brought together scholars, poets, and friends. They called themselves the Inimitable Livers, a playful title that spoke not of indulgence alone, but of the uniqueness of their bond. At these feasts, the air shimmered with conversation, with stories told and retold, with riddles and laughter that drifted long past midnight. Cleopatra, radiant in her flowing gowns of fine linen and jewels that caught the torchlight, presided with quiet grace, her laughter mingling with Antony's in harmony. Yet beyond the feasts and the celebrations, their life together held a deep stillness. There were evenings when they set aside the trappings of royalty and power, when they sat quietly by the banks of the Nile. The river glimmered in the moonlight, its waters calm, carrying with them the endless song of Egypt. Cleopatra would tell Antony the stories of the gods, of Isis and Osiris, of Horus and Are, her voice flowing like poetry across the water. Antony listened, enchanted not only by the tales, but by the reverence with which she spoke, her words weaving together past and present in a seamless thread. In turn, Antony shared stories of Rome, not its battles, but of its people. He told her the bustling streets, of the way voices rose in the forum, of the scent of bread from humble bakeries, of the clamor of markets where citizens from all walks of life gathered. Cleopatra listened, her eyes bright, for though Egypt was her heart, she delighted in the richness of the world beyond, and in hearing it through his eyes. Their bond deepened further with the birth of their children. Cleopatra held them close, their laughter filling the palace halls, their small hands reaching for the world with innocence. Antony looked upon them with pride, his gaze softened by the knowledge that these lives were not merely heirs, but symbols of love that had transcended distance, politics, and expectation. To Cleopatra, her family was both her joy and her anchor, a reminder that amid the shifting tides of empire, there was a haven of tenderness. And yet, amid the harmony of their days, Cleopatra was never without wisdom. She knew the world beyond Alexandria was restless. She knew Rome's eyes were always turned toward them, measuring, judging, weighing their choices. But she did not let the shadow of that knowledge dim her present. Instead, she embraced the beauty of each moment. The fragrance of lotus blossoms at dawn, the sound of Antony's laughter echoing in the colonnades, the steady heartbeat of a city alive with song. For in those years, Cleopatra and Antony created not only a life of grandeur, but of shared humanity. They became more than rulers, more than symbols of empire. They became companions in the fullest sense, partners who carried each other through burdens of rule, who celebrated life's simple joys, who dreamed not only of power, but of peace. And so, Alexandria flourished, its streets alive with color, its nights filled with music, its people comforted by the sight of their queen walking hand in hand with a man who had chosen to share her world. For a time, it seemed as though the river of life itself had slowed, offering them a season of peace, of love, of radiant calm before the currents of fate would stir again. The peace of Alexandria could not last forever. Beyond the walls of Cleopatra's palace, the world stirred restlessly. Rome, ever hungry, ever watchful, called Antony back into its orbit. Messages arrived across the sea, letters sealed in wax, bearing the urgency of Senate and generals. Antony was needed once more in the West, where rivalries brewed and voices clashed over who would hold the legacy of Caesar. Cleopatra understood. She had always known that love with a Roman could never be untouched by duty. Antony's heart was bound to her, but his destiny was bound to Rome. With calm strength, she watched him prepare for departure. They walked together through the gardens in the cool of the evening, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine. Words were few, for both knew the truth without speaking. Distance would test what they had built. When Antony sailed away, Cleopatra stood upon the balcony as she once had for Caesar, watching the sails vanish into the horizon. This time, she felt not only longing, but also the quiet ache of foresight. She knew the world beyond Egypt would not look kindly upon their union. Yet she held fast to her certainty, as steady as the river's flow, that love could endure even when tested by storms. News drifted back across the sea, carried by travelers, merchants, and envoys. Antony struggled with obligations in Rome. Pulled between loyalties and alliances, his name tangled with Octavian, the adopted son of Caesar, whose ambition was sharp as iron. Cleopatra listened to these tidings with a calm face, though her heart sensed the shadow that was forming. In time, Antony returned, weary, yet drawn back to her as surely as the tide returns to the shore. Their bond, tested by distance, rekindled with ease. They found solace again in Alexandria, in nights of music and mornings of sunlight spilling across marble floors. And yet the shadow grew. Rome whispered of scandal, of betrayal, of Antony's devotion to Egypt over his homeland. Octavian, ever watchful, wove these whispers into weapons, crafting a tale in which Cleopatra was painted not as queen, but as temptress, as threat. The stage was set for conflict, though within the palace, Cleopatra sought stillness. She tended to her children. She governed her land. She cherished each moment with Antony as though it were a jewel to be kept forever. But the storm could not be held back. Octavian's legions marched, his fleet sailed, and soon the waters of Actium bore witness to the clash of empires. The battle did not fall in their favor. Cleopatra and Antony, though strong, were overcome by Rome's relentless tide. They returned to Egypt, carrying with them the weight of defeat. Alexandria, once so radiant, grew quiet, its people uncertain of what lay ahead. In those final days, Cleopatra walked often through her gardens. The lotus still bloomed, the fountain still sang, the Nile still flowed as always had. Yet she felt the approach of an ending. She was not afraid, for fear was foreign to her nature. Instead, she carried within her a calm acceptance, like the desert accepting the setting sun. Antony, torn by loss and by the shadows of pride, faltered before her eyes. Cleopatra stayed with him, her presence as steady as it had ever been. She reminded him of their laughter, of their children, of the love that had carried them through years of both triumph and trial. When his final hour came, it was not in the clamor of war, but in the stillness of their bond, his hand resting in hers, his spirit released into the quiet night. Left alone with her children, and her kingdom trembling, Cleopatra faced Octavian's arrival. She knew what Rome intended, to parade her as a prize, to strip Egypt of its dignity. That she would not allow. Her life had been lived as a queen, her love as a woman of depth and courage. She would not see her story end in chains. And so, in the hush of her final hours, Cleopatra chose her own path. Surrounded by the symbols of her reign, draped in the robes of a queen, she prepared herself as one prepares for a sacred rite. Whether by serpent's bite, as legend says, or by gentler means, she passed from this world with the same grace that had defined her life. Calm, resolute, sovereign of her fate. The palace fell into silence, yet beyond its walls, Egypt breathed on. The Nile continued its eternal journey. The lotus continued to bloom. The stars continued to scatter their light upon the desert. Cleopatra's children would carry her memory, and the world would carry her story, told and retold across generations. She was more than her loves, more than her losses. She was the voice of a kingdom, the breath of a river, the light of a civilization that had stood for millennia. Her power was not only in crowns and thrones, but in the way she shaped her destiny with dignity, even as the world closed in. And so her story rests not in sorrow, but in stillness. Cleopatra, queen of Egypt, companion of Caesar, beloved of Antony, mother, dreamer, ruler, and woman of unshakable presence. She remains forever in the flow of history, her name carried like a whisper on the Nile, her spirit shining in the timeless rhythm of stars above the desert night.